Hi, Data Ben here. Today we're going to cover promises in JavaScript. So promises are a great way to run asynchronous functions in JavaScript and run them one after another. The great thing about these functions is they can be in three different states. So they can be in pending when they're running, and then they can be in fulfilled once they've been resolved, or they can actually fail and be in a rejected state. And the great thing about promises is then we can do things on the back of these three different states. So let's have a look at a promise and let's have a look at promise chains. So in this code, I've set up three promises here. So we have P1, P2 and P3, and they're very similar to each other. So we have a try catch in each of the promises, and I will just break down what each of them do. So I'm going to minimize P1 and P2, and we'll look at promise number 3 here. So the first thing about a promise is it's declared with a new promise, and then it has two variables or two arguments, which are resolve and reject. So a promise is either pending, it's resolved or fulfilled, or it's rejected. And what we've done here is we've got a little bit of a timeout to make it as though it's a network request here, and we're trying the argument here, so resolve, and we've said promise 3 resolved, or if there's an error it'll reject with promise 3 rejected followed by the error message. So each of these three promises is very similar to each other, so I'm going to minimize P3 as well, and now we'll look at the promise chain. So we have P1 here, which is the first promise that we're running. And what we follow the P1 with is a dot then. So we're saying run promise 1. So if we just expand promise 1 here, it's going to resolve to P1 resolved. So it's going to return the resolution of P1 resolved. And then we actually want to print out that message. So in the then function here, we actually do need a callback function. So instead of just console.log, we've actually got the return message from P1, which is the resolution message, the fulfilled message, and we log it out. And if that's successful, it'll go on to run P2, again with a callback function. So the reason we're doing this is because it has to be, the argument has to be a callback function rather than just the promise itself. So we'll then call P2, and then again we'll log the successful message from P2, and then do the same for P3. So let's actually, before we talk about the catch and finally arguments, let's just run this code to see the result. So we see P1 resolved, P2 resolved, then P3 resolved. So they all happen 1 second after another, because in P2 there's a timeout of 1, so P1 runs straight away, and under P2 there's a timeout of 1 second, and under P3 there's a timeout of 2 seconds. So this is simulating, for example, a network request, which is taking some time. So I'll just run that once more. P1 resolved, P2 resolved, P3 resolved. So when you add a catch to a promise chain, what will happen is it will actually count for everything in the chain before it. So this catch, which catches any error. So if the error happens in P1 or P2 or P3, it will actually throw the error here in this catch statement. Now we don't have any errors currently, so we're going to actually introduce one. So I'm going to actually change this resolve to something which cannot resolve. So we'll just put blah 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 in here, so it's a made up variable, and run the code again, and we'll see P1 resolved, but then instead of P2 resolved, we'll see our message error caught. Message is P2 rejected, reference error blah 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 is not defined, and it will actually terminate the promise chain. So it's caught an error at this point in the, sorry, it's a P2 in the promise chain, and it's cascaded down to the next catch error statement. And finally, we have this useful argument called finally. So after all of the thens, all the chained thens have completed, and it's gone past the catch as well, we have a finally. So This is just any code that wants to be run at the end of the promise chain. So if I run this again, still with the error in place, we'll see P1 resolved, error caught, but we also still get the promise chain complete. And then if I actually remove this error, so I change this back to P2 resolved and just run the code again, we'll see that we have P1 resolved, P2 resolved, P3 resolved, and the promise chain complete there. So promises are a great way to run code that's dependent on each other. So this could be, for example, running a network request to a website, downloading some data, then downloading some data from a database, then updating your DOM object, so updating your browser to display this data. Now you're not going to be able to update the browser without the data. You're not going to be able to update the database without the connection to the network request. So promises are a fantastic way to chain these different challenges together and have them complete asynchronously, and as soon as they're ready, have them actually resolve one after another with proper error handling. But what happens if, say, P2 is the update to the download from the database, and that this fails? We don't actually want the whole promise chain to stop. So a good idea to do there is actually to move another catch after this, so we can catch the error and then safely continue with the rest of the code. So I'm going to reintroduce the error here. So we'll put blah 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 back in here, so it will throw the reject instead of fulfilled, and we'll put an extra catch here. So let's just run this. So we see P1 resolved, error caught, and then it's not actually done, it's actually printed out the undefined, so we want the catch to be one line lower. So we've just moved it down one line, and then run again, P1 resolved, error caught, message is P2 rejected, and so on. But then you'll see it's actually continued. It's then gone, okay, you've caught the error message, let's continue. So instead of having just one catch at the end, where one failure will fail the promise chain, you can actually put catches throughout the promise chain and handle these gracefully as you're going along. Because it could be, for example, if you don't download the data from the database, you could still want to do some draw updates to the DOM or handle this in another way. So it gives you the option in a promise chain to handle these errors gracefully and continue with the rest of the promises. So this is quite an extensive promise chain that we have running here. I will just fix this error message so it no longer has any issues. So we'll say P2 resolved. And now let's look at some other promise functionality that we can use. So I'm actually going to comment all of this out here. And now we're going to use this promise all. So we have promise all, which will actually complete all the promises in an array at once, and will output any errors if there's any errors. So let's just run promise all. So you'll see there was a short delay as there's a timeout on the promises, and it came back with an array of P1 resolved, P2 resolved, and P3 resolved. Now if there's an error, it will actually do as before and show the error on promise all. But I wanted to demonstrate a successful one of the promises, which worked there. Next there's allSettled, which is very similar to promise all, but it will give you actually a little bit more information. So if we actually run this allSettled, we'll see that it actually also comes back with the value, the result with P1 resolved, P2 resolved, P3 resolved, but it also comes back with the status as well. So fulfilled, fulfilled, fulfilled. So all of them were completed successfully. Let's reintroduce the error message into P2 and run this again. So we now have a different result. So you can see we have status fulfilled, P1 resolved. Status for P2 has come back as rejected, and it's come back with the reason as well, the error message that we've allowed in. So P2 rejected, reference error, and then it's continued for P3 to be resolved as well. So it will actually wait until all three of the promises are out of pending status and into settled status. And settled just means it's either fulfilled or it's rejected, and that's it. So once all the promises within the array have been settled, you will get this report output here, which is very useful to see what's happening and what's failing without using a promise chain. Finally, we have promise race. So I'm going to comment out all settled here, and we'll uncomment out promise race. So and we'll run this. So what promise race does is it accepts an array of promises, and it will actually just come back and log the quickest promise. So we have these in a timeout above. We have one that runs straight away, P1, P2, which runs 1 second afterwards, and P3, which runs 1 second after that. So the race winner should be P1. Let's see if that works. Okay, so there we go. Racing, the winner is P1 resolved. So in conclusion, promises are extremely useful in JavaScript for running asynchronous code. I've actually uncommented everything, and you can see if I run the code now, all of the different types of promises that I've done here all run at the same time with no issue. So we can see here P1 resolved, we did the race where P1 won, then P2 resolved, and then we've had, so there's been a little bit of a race at the end for outputting the P promise all here, and then promise all fulfilled, or all settled, sorry, here, and finally the promise chain complete finished shortly after this. So you can run these promises, you can run an asynchronous code like this, and it will all be guaranteed to finish in the appropriate order. And you can capture error messages in as granular level as you want by using catch statements, or you can use a catch statement at the end, and it will just catch the first error that comes up there. And also, of course, you can use the finally to trigger any code at the end of the promise chain. So the use of promises is very widespread in JavaScript, and is also used with something called async and async functions and await, which we'll be covering in the next video. Thanks for watching.